What's the worst thing a coach ever did? My basketball coach made us practice through injuries he called mental weakness, and 3 players ended up with permanent disabilities. The orthopedic surgeon held up Jamal's MRI scan against the light box, and I watched his jaw tighten as he traced the white fracture lines spiderwebbing through the tibia. This bone has been broken for at least 6 weeks. How has this child been walking, let alone playing basketball? Dr. Anita Gershwin had been practicing sports medicine for 19 years, and I could see genuine anger replacing her usual clinical detachment. Jamal sat on the exam table with his leg elevated, face carefully blank in that way we'd all learned to hide pain. His mother was crying quietly in the corner. Coach Vance was not there because we'd stopped telling him about doctor's appointments 3 months ago, right around the time he'd started calling medical professionals quitters who couldn't hack real athletics. I was there because Jamal had begged me to come, and because I was the team captain who'd finally realized we weren't training for excellence. We were being systematically destroyed. I'd been playing basketball since I was 8 years old, working my way up through rec leagues and AAU teams until I made varsity as a freshman at Lincoln Prep Academy. The program was legendary in our state, consistently ranked in the top 10 nationally, with a pipeline to Division I colleges that made parents fight for enrollment spots. Coach Dennis Vance had built that reputation over 12 years, turning Lincoln Prep into a basketball powerhouse with 3 state championships and over 30 college placements. He was intense and demanding, known for producing winners who could handle pressure. Parents loved him because he got results. Players respected him because he had a way of making you believe you could achieve things you'd thought were impossible. When he pulled me aside after tryouts my freshman year and said I had the potential to play at the highest levels if I was willing to work harder than I'd ever worked in my life, I felt chosen, special, ready to prove myself. The first season was grueling but manageable. 6 days a week practice, 2 hours minimum, with additional conditioning sessions on Sunday mornings. Coach Vance's philosophy was that basketball was 90% mental toughness and 10% physical skill. He said the body could do anything the mind commanded, that pain was just weakness leaving the body, that champions were separated from everyone else by their ability to push through discomfort. He had these sayings posted all over the gym, motivational quotes about mental fortitude and refusing to quit. At 15, surrounded by seniors who bought into his philosophy completely, I internalized every word. When my knees ached after 3-hour practices, I told myself I was getting stronger. When I was so tired I could barely focus in class, I told myself this was the price of excellence. The culture Coach Vance created was all-consuming and intense. He demanded complete loyalty, making it clear that questioning his methods meant you lacked the mental toughness to succeed. Players who complained about pain were benched and publicly shamed in front of the team. He'd make examples of them, having them sit on the sidelines during practice while the rest of us ran drills, pointing out how their weakness was holding the team back. He'd say things like, "That's what happens when you let your body control your mind, instead of the other way around." The message was clear. Admitting pain meant you were weak, and weakness was the worst thing you could be. So we learned to hide our pain, to play through injuries, to prove we had the mental toughness Coach Vance demanded. My sophomore year, the intensity increased. Coach Vance implemented what he called mental conditioning sessions, where we'd practice through exhaustion, pushing past the point where our bodies wanted to quit. He said this was where champions were made, in those moments when every part of you wanted to stop, but you kept going anyway. We'd run sprints until players were vomiting on the sidelines, then run more. We'd do defensive drills for 90 minutes straight without water breaks because games don't stop for hydration. Looking back, I can see these weren't training methods. They were systematic conditioning to ignore our body's warning signals. But at the time, surrounded by teammates who were enduring the same thing, it felt normal. We were special. We were tougher than other teams. That's why we won. That was also the year I first noticed something was seriously wrong. Our point guard, Marcus Chen, I need to use a different name. Our point guard, David Ling, rolled his ankle during practice in November. It swelled up immediately, turning purple and grotesque. Coach Vance barely glanced at it before telling David to walk it off, that sprains were minor injuries that didn't require rest. David hobbled through the next week of practices, the swelling never fully going down, limping noticeably during games. When David's parents wanted to take him to a doctor, Coach Vance called them during team practice and put the call on speaker so we could all hear him explaining that their son needed to develop mental toughness, that coddling him would ruin his potential. David's parents, intimidated by Coach Vance's authority and reputation, backed down. David played through the injury for the rest of the season. By March, he couldn't run without severe pain. An MRI finally revealed he'd torn 3 ligaments in his ankle, requiring surgery and 9 months of physical therapy. He never played basketball again. I told myself David's injury was a fluke, bad luck, not related to Coach Vance's training methods. The cognitive dissonance was easier than admitting I was part of a system that had destroyed my teammates' athletic career. Coach Vance framed David's injury as a cautionary tale about not being tough enough initially, saying if David had pushed through the pain properly instead of babying it, the ligaments wouldn't have weakened. It made no medical sense, but at 16, surrounded by adults who seemed to accept this logic, I believed him. We all did. Junior year brought new players and escalated intensity. Coach Vance had recruited heavily, bringing in 3 sophomores who were already being watched by college scouts. Jamal Williams was a 6'5" forward with incredible court vision. Christina Delgado was a point guard who could thread passes through impossible angles. And Trevor Ashton was a shooting guard whose 3-point percentage was nearly 60. They were talented, dedicated, and completely unprepared for Coach Vance's methods. Within 2 months, all 3 were showing signs of overtraining. Jamal complained of shin pain that kept him awake at night. Christina developed stress fractures in both feet from the constant running and jumping on inadequate rest. Trevor's shoulder started making clicking sounds every time he shot, pain radiating down his arm. Coach Vance's response to their injuries was to question their mental toughness, to suggest they were too soft, too used to being coddled by previous coaches. He made them practice harder, longer, pushing them to prove they could overcome physical discomfort through willpower. He started filming them during their most painful moments, capturing their grimaces and struggles, then showing the footage during team meetings as examples of players working through adversity. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and cruel. He'd praise them publicly for their toughness while privately increasing their training load. He'd tell their parents they were developing championship mentality. He'd point to our winning record as proof his methods worked. I was team captain by then, a position Coach Vance had given me with specific instructions to help enforce his philosophy. He wanted me to call out teammates who weren't pushing hard enough, to report anyone who complained about injuries or expressed doubt about training methods. I was supposed to be his lieutenant, helping maintain the culture of extreme toughness he'd created. And for a while, I did exactly that. I'm not proud of it now, but I called out teammates for showing weakness. I repeated Coach Vance's mantras about mental fortitude. I helped create an environment where admitting pain was shameful. But watching Jamal limp through practices while his shin pain obviously worsened, something started shifting in me. He'd ice his legs for hours after practice, taking ibuprofen constantly, wearing compression sleeves that did nothing to address the underlying damage. His mother had asked Coach Vance multiple times about getting medical evaluation, and each time Coach Vance would reassure her that Jamal was fine, that soreness was normal for growing athletes, that he'd personally monitored hundreds of players through similar discomfort. Mrs. Williams trusted him because everyone trusted him. He had 12 years of success, 3 championship rings, and a wall covered in thank you letters from former players at major universities. The breaking point for Jamal came during a practice in January. We were running defensive slides, a drill we'd done thousands of times, when Jamal suddenly screamed and collapsed. Not a yell of exertion, but a genuine scream of agony that made everyone freeze. He was clutching his lower leg, tears streaming down his face, unable to stand. Coach Vance walked over and told him to get up, that this was exactly the kind of mental weakness he'd been warning about. Jamal tried to stand and collapsed again, sobbing now. Coach Vance's face hardened, and he told Jamal to get off the court if he was going to be dramatic, that real players pushed through pain. I helped Jamal to the locker room, feeling his whole body shaking as he leaned on me. His shin was swollen and hot to the touch, the skin tight and discolored. I told him we needed to call his mom, that something was seriously wrong. Jamal begged me not to, saying Coach Vance would bench him permanently if he went to a doctor, that he'd lose his chance at college scholarships. The fear in his voice wasn't about injury, it was about disappointing Coach Vance. That's when I realized how completely our coach had twisted our priorities, making us more afraid of his disapproval than of permanent physical damage. I called Mrs. Williams anyway. She arrived at the school 30 minutes later and took Jamal straight to the emergency room. The x-rays showed a complete fracture of the tibia that had started as a stress fracture weeks earlier and had finally broken all the way through because Jamal had kept practicing on damaged bone. The emergency room doctor, Dr. Neil Carmichael, who'd worked in sports medicine for 15 years, asked pointed questions about how long Jamal had been experiencing pain and why he hadn't sought treatment sooner. Mrs. Williams explained about Coach Vance's philosophy, about not wanting to seem weak, about trusting the coach's judgment. Dr. Carmichael's expression turned grim. He said he'd seen similar injuries in military training programs and professional athletics, but never in high school players. He said what had happened to Jamal was completely preventable and bordered on negligent. Jamal needed surgery to repair the fracture with pins and plates. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Anita Gershwin, explained that because the bone had been broken for so long before treatment, the healing process would be complicated. The surrounding tissue had been damaged by weeks of continued stress on fractured bone. Jamal might have permanent mobility issues. He definitely wouldn't play basketball for at least a year, possibly never at his previous level. His college recruitment, which had been promising with several Division II schools expressing interest, evaporated. Coaches stopped calling. His future had been derailed by a preventable injury that a trusted authority figure had told him to ignore. Mrs. Williams was devastated and furious. She scheduled a meeting with Principal Eleanor Vasquez, the athletic director Leonard Franklin, and Coach Vance. I wasn't supposed to be there, but Mrs. Williams asked me to come as a witness to the culture Coach Vance had created. The meeting was tense from the start. Mrs. Williams presented Dr. Gershwin's medical report, which explicitly stated that Jamal's injury was the result of continued athletic activity on damaged bone over an extended period. She explained how Coach Vance had discouraged medical treatment, had called pain a mental weakness, had created an environment where seeking help was seen as failure. Coach Vance defended himself smoothly, too smoothly. He said he'd never told any player not to seek medical treatment, that he encouraged proper health management, that Jamal must have misunderstood his motivational coaching style. He said high-level athletics required pushing through discomfort, and maybe Jamal wasn't mentally prepared for that level of competition. He suggested that Jamal's injury was unfortunate, but not related to training methods, that stress fractures were common in growing athletes, that he couldn't be held responsible for every player's individual medical situation. Principal Vasquez and Athletic Director Franklin nodded along, clearly wanting to believe their star coach over a single injured player's mother. That's when I spoke up. I told them about David Ling's ankle injury 2 years earlier, about how Coach Vance had discouraged medical treatment then, too. I told them about Christina's stress fractures that she was currently playing through without diagnosis. I told them about Trevor's shoulder injury that was getting progressively worse. I explained the culture of fear Coach Vance had created, where admitting pain meant being benched and shamed, where questioning his methods meant being kicked off the team. I told them I'd participated in enforcing that culture and regretted it deeply. The room went silent. Coach Vance stared at me with barely concealed rage. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. He said I was a disgruntled player trying to undermine him because I wasn't getting enough playing time, that I was making up stories to explain my own performance failures. Athletic Director Franklin looked uncomfortable, but suggested maybe we were overreacting, that tough coaching wasn't the same as abuse, that Coach Vance's track record spoke for itself. Principal Vasquez said she'd look into the matter, but made it clear she didn't want to rush to judgment about such a valued staff member. Mrs. Williams left the meeting furious, promising this wasn't over. I left knowing I'd made an enemy of Coach Vance and possibly destroyed my own basketball career. But I also left knowing I'd done the right thing, even if it came too late for Jamal. That night, Coach Vance sent a group text to the entire team, saying I'd been removed as captain due to failure to maintain team loyalty and standards. He didn't say anything else, didn't need to. Everyone understood I'd been marked as a traitor. The next practice was brutal. Coach Vance had the team run suicide sprints for 40 minutes straight, saying we needed to rebuild our mental toughness after one weak member had tried to poison team culture. He didn't say my name, but everyone knew who he meant. Players who'd been my friends for years wouldn't look at me. After practice, several teammates confronted me in the parking lot, angry that I'd tried to ruin Coach Vance's career, asking if I was happy about destroying the team. Only 2 players defended me. Christina, whose feet were so damaged she could barely walk without pain, and a freshman named Kevin Barnes who quietly said someone needed to speak up. Over the next 2 weeks, I documented everything I could. I started recording practices on my phone, capturing Coach Vance's statements about playing through pain and his public shaming of injured players. I saved every text message and email Coach Vance had sent about not letting injuries slow us down. I contacted David Ling and asked about his injury. He was bitter, still dealing with chronic ankle pain at 19, his college basketball dreams long dead. He'd kept his medical records showing that Coach Vance had discouraged treatment. I talked to Christina's parents, who'd been growing concerned about her constant pain, but hadn't wanted to question the coach's authority. And I reached out to Trevor's family, who admitted they'd noticed his shoulder deteriorating, but trusted Coach Vance's assurances that it was just soreness. Then Christina collapsed during a game. We were playing our regional rival, a packed gymnasium with college scouts in attendance, when Christina drove for a layup and came down awkwardly. Both her feet gave out simultaneously, and she crumpled to the floor, screaming. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent gym, a raw expression of agony that made the referee immediately call for medical assistance. Coach Vance tried to wave off the concern, saying Christina just needed a minute, but the opposing team's coach insisted on calling an ambulance. Christina was crying as the EMTs loaded her onto a stretcher, her feet at unnatural angles, clearly broken. The emergency room x-rays revealed that both of Christina's feet had multiple stress fractures that had been gradually worsening over months. The impact from landing after the layup had caused several fractures to complete, essentially shattering the small bones in both feet. Dr. Carmichael was the attending physician again, and this time he was vocal about his concerns. He told Christina's parents, the Delgados, that their daughter had been playing on damaged bones for so long that the healing process would be extensive and potentially incomplete. She needed surgery on both feet, months of non-weight-bearing recovery, and intense physical therapy. Her basketball career was over. At 15 years old, because of preventable injuries that had been ignored and worsened through continued play. Mr. and Mrs. Delgado were immigrant parents who'd worked multiple jobs to afford Lincoln Prep's tuition, who'd trusted the prestigious school and its celebrated coach to take care of their talented daughter. They spoke limited English and had felt intimidated challenging Coach Vance's authority. Now their daughter's college scholarship hopes were destroyed, and they were facing thousands of dollars in medical bills. They were devastated and angry, finally understanding that their trust had been weaponized against their child. The school could no longer ignore 2 catastrophic injuries in 3 weeks. Principal Vasquez called an emergency meeting of the school board, and I was asked to provide testimony. I brought my documentation. Videos of practices showing Coach Vance pushing injured players, text messages where he called medical treatment weakness, testimonies from David, Jamal, and Christina about the culture of fear he'd created. I also brought medical records from Dr. Carmichael and Dr. Gershwin, both of whom had submitted written statements expressing concern about the pattern of injuries they'd seen in Lincoln Prep basketball players. The school board meeting was supposed to be confidential, but word leaked quickly. Parents packed the meeting room, some supporting Coach Vance with signs praising his dedication, others demanding accountability. Local news stations set up cameras outside, sensing a story. The board members looked overwhelmed as they reviewed the documentation I'd provided. One board member, Patricia Hoffman, who had a background in education law, kept asking why the school had no protocol for monitoring player injuries, why there was no required medical clearance for continued play, why Coach Vance had been given unlimited authority over player health and safety. Coach Vance defended himself with the same smooth confidence he'd always had. He said he'd dedicated his life to developing young athletes, that his methods had produced winners for 12 years, that a few unfortunate injuries didn't negate his overall success. He presented letters from former players at Division I universities, testimonials praising his tough love approach and crediting him with their success. He suggested that the injured players lacked the mental toughness required for elite athletics, that not everyone could handle high-level training, that their failures weren't his responsibility. Several parents applauded his statement, shouting that their kids had thrived under his coaching. Then Dr. Gershwin testified. She'd attended the meeting specifically to provide medical perspective, and her testimony was devastating. She explained that stress fractures in adolescent athletes were completely preventable with proper training loads and adequate rest. She said the pattern of injuries at Lincoln Prep suggested systematic overtraining without medical oversight. She presented research showing that young athletes were particularly vulnerable to overuse injuries because their bones and joints were still developing. She said that any coach who discouraged injured players from seeking medical treatment was engaging in dangerous and potentially criminal behavior. She said 3 permanent injuries in 3 years from a single program was not bad luck. It was evidence of systemic problems. The room shifted after her testimony. Board members who'd seemed sympathetic to Coach Vance started asking harder questions. Why hadn't any injured players been required to get medical clearance before returning to play? Why were parents discouraged from seeking second opinions? Why was there no oversight of training intensity? Coach Vance's answers became defensive and evasive, his trademark confidence cracking. Athletic Director Franklin, who'd enabled Coach Vance for years, suddenly started distancing himself, saying he'd assumed Coach Vance was following proper protocols, that he hadn't been aware of injury concerns. The board voted to suspend Coach Vance pending a full investigation. He erupted in anger, accusing me of destroying the program out of jealousy, calling the board weak for caving to pressure from parents who couldn't handle real athletics. Security had to escort him from the building. His exit was captured by news cameras, and by morning, the story was everywhere. Celebrated coach suspended after players suffer permanent injuries. The narrative Coach Vance had controlled for 12 years had finally broken. The investigation took 6 weeks. The school hired an independent firm, Westmore Educational Consulting, led by Dr. Raymond Cho, who specialized in institutional athletic abuse. His team interviewed every player who'd been on the basketball team during the past 5 years, every parent, every staff member who'd interacted with the program. They reviewed medical records, training logs, and communications. The report they produced was damning and detailed, documenting a pattern of systematic overtraining, medical neglect, and psychological manipulation that had persisted for years, while school administrators looked the other way. The report found that Coach Vance had created a culture where seeking medical treatment was actively discouraged through shame, threats of benching, and accusations of mental weakness. It documented 17 players over 5 years who'd sustained serious injuries that had been inadequately treated or deliberately ignored. It found that Athletic Director Franklin had been aware of parent complaints about injuries, but had failed to investigate. It found that school nurses had raised concerns about player health that had been dismissed. The report concluded that Coach Vance's methods constituted abuse, and that the school's failure to provide oversight had enabled that abuse. The school board held another meeting to respond to the findings. This time, the room was packed with reporters and camera crews. Board member Patricia Hoffman read a statement acknowledging the school's failures and announcing immediate changes. Coach Vance was terminated, Athletic Director Franklin was placed on administrative leave, and new protocols were being implemented requiring medical clearance for all injured athletes. The board also announced they were contacting all former players to offer support and encourage medical evaluation for any ongoing issues from their time in the program. But Coach Vance wasn't done. He hired an attorney, Douglas Westfield, who specialized in employment disputes, and threatened to sue the school for wrongful termination. Westfield held a press conference claiming Coach Vance was being scapegoated for injuries that were inherent risks in athletics, that the investigation had been biased, that his client's stellar 12-year record was being destroyed by a few disgruntled families. Some parents rallied around Coach Vance, organizing a petition to reinstate him. arguing that toughness was necessary for championship athletics. That's when Trevor's injury became undeniable. His shoulder had been deteriorating throughout this entire process, the clicking and pain getting progressively worse. His parents had finally taken him to a specialist, Dr. Vivian Ashworth, an orthopedic surgeon with expertise in adolescent sports injuries. The MRI showed catastrophic damage to Trevor's rotator cuff and labrum, injuries that typically took years to develop and were almost never seen in 16-year-old athletes. Dr. Ashworth said Trevor needed immediate surgery and would likely never regain full range of motion in his shoulder. His ability to play basketball, to raise his arm above his head without pain, to live without chronic discomfort, was permanently compromised. Dr. Ashworth was horrified by Trevor's case and decided to go public. She held her own press conference, showing Trevor's MRI scans and explaining in medical terms how the injuries had developed through repetitive stress without adequate rest or treatment. She said she'd contacted several sports medicine colleagues who'd reviewed the case, and all agreed this was one of the worst examples of adolescent athletic abuse they'd seen. She called for criminal investigation of Coach Vance and civil liability for the school. Her press conference was picked up nationally, and suddenly Lincoln Prep's basketball program was the subject of major news coverage. The district attorney, Margaret Collier, who'd prosecuted child endangerment cases for 18 years, opened a criminal investigation. Detectives interviewed players, parents, and medical professionals. They subpoenaed school records, training logs, and communications. The evidence was overwhelming. Coach Vance had systematically endangered minors through reckless training practices and medical neglect. In April, 4 months after Jamal's injury first exposed the problems, Coach Vance was arrested and charged with 3 counts of child endangerment and 3 counts of reckless endangerment. The criminal trial happened in September. I testified, as did Jamal, Christina, Trevor, David, and 6 other former players who'd sustained serious injuries under Coach Vance's coaching. We described the culture of fear he'd created, the way he'd manipulated us into ignoring our body's warnings, the psychological tactics he'd used to maintain control. Dr. Gershwin, Dr. Carmichael, and Dr. Ashworth testified about the medical evidence, explaining how each injury was preventable and had been worsened by continued athletic activity. Coach Vance's defense was that he'd been following standard practices for elite athletics, that high-level training necessarily involved discomfort, that he'd never intended harm. His attorney presented testimony from some former players who'd succeeded in college basketball and credited Coach Vance's tough methods. But the prosecution's evidence was too strong. Text messages where Coach Vance explicitly told injured players not to seek medical treatment, videos of him mocking players for showing pain, medical records documenting the progression of preventable injuries that he'd ignored. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. They found Coach Vance guilty on all 6 counts. The judge, Honorable Kevin Matthews, who'd presided over juvenile and family cases for 23 years, was blunt in his sentencing remarks. He said Coach Vance had betrayed the trust placed in him by parents and players, had prioritized winning over child safety, had created a system that systematically endangered minors. He sentenced Coach Vance to 4 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation with conditions preventing him from any coaching or supervisory role with minors. The civil cases followed. The Williams family, the Delgado family, and the Ashton family all sued Lincoln Prep Academy and Coach Vance for negligence and damages. The school's insurance company settled quickly, paying substantial damages to cover medical expenses, future care needs, lost scholarship opportunities, and pain and suffering. The settlements included provisions for ongoing medical monitoring and treatment for all 3 families. The school also implemented comprehensive reforms: mandatory medical clearance protocols, limits on practice hours, independent athletic trainers with authority to pull players from activity, and annual third-party audits of all athletic programs. Athletic Director Franklin was fired and lost his teaching license after an administrative hearing found he'd enabled Coach Vance's abuse through willful ignorance. Principal Vasquez resigned under pressure from parents and the school board. Several board members who'd initially defended Coach Vance chose not to run for re-election. The entire institutional structure that had protected Coach Vance was dismantled. The aftermath was complicated for everyone involved. Jamal spent a year in physical therapy and regained most of his mobility, but his basketball career was over. He refocused on academics and got into a good university on an academic scholarship, planning to study sports medicine with the goal of helping other young athletes avoid what happened to him. Christina's recovery took longer, requiring 2 surgeries and 18 months of rehabilitation. She walks with a slight limp and deals with chronic foot pain, but she's learned to manage it. She's become an advocate for youth athlete safety, speaking at schools and sports organizations about the warning signs of abusive coaching. Trevor's shoulder will never fully heal. He's had 3 surgeries and countless physical therapy sessions, but still can't raise his arm above shoulder height without pain. He's dealing with depression and anger about his stolen future, working with therapists to process the trauma. David Ling, the first player I knew of who was seriously injured, joined their advocacy efforts. Together, the 4 of them started a non-profit organization called Safe Sports Youth, dedicated to educating parents and young athletes about abusive coaching practices and advocating for better protections in school athletic programs. They testify at state legislative hearings, consult with schools developing safety protocols, and provide resources for families dealing with similar situations. They've helped change laws in our state regarding athletic oversight and medical requirements. As for me, I finished high school dealing with complicated guilt about my role in perpetuating Coach Vance's culture. I'd been his lieutenant, had enforced his rules, had called out teammates for weakness. Dr. Gershwin recommended I see a therapist, Dr. Lucas Montgomery, who specialized in guilt and moral injury. Through therapy, I worked on understanding that I'd also been a victim of Coach Vance's manipulation, that recognizing the abuse and speaking up had been important even if it came late. Dr. Montgomery helped me see that part of my healing would be using what I'd learned to prevent similar situations. I went to college and studied kinesiology and sports psychology, specifically focusing on adolescent athletic development and coaching ethics. I wrote my senior thesis on the psychology of abusive coaching and how institutions enable it through unchecked authority and culture of winning at all costs. The thesis got published in a sports psychology journal, and I've been invited to speak at coaching conferences about recognizing and preventing abusive practices. I'm now working toward a doctorate, researching how to build healthy athletic cultures that develop young athletes without destroying them. The basketball program at Lincoln Prep was completely rebuilt with a new coach, new protocols, and a new philosophy. They haven't won a state championship since Coach Vance left, but the players are healthy, the parents are involved, and nobody's getting permanently injured. Some alumni from the championship years complain that the program has gone soft, that today's players don't have the toughness we had. Every time I hear that, I think about Jamal's broken leg, Christina's shattered feet, Trevor's destroyed shoulder. I think about what that supposed toughness actually cost. Coach Vance served 3 years of his 4-year sentence and was released on parole. He's not allowed to coach minors, and his conviction makes it nearly impossible to work in athletics. Last I heard, he was working in construction and still insisting he did nothing wrong, that he was a victim of political correctness and parents who couldn't handle demanding coaching. He's never apologized to any of his victims. I don't expect he ever will. Some people are more committed to their narrative than to truth. The worst thing a coach ever did wasn't just pushing us through injuries. It was making us believe that our pain didn't matter, that our bodies were obstacles to overcome rather than parts of ourselves deserving care and respect. It was conditioning us to ignore our instincts, to distrust our own experience, to see seeking help as weakness. 3 players ended up with permanent disabilities, but dozens more were psychologically damaged by a system that taught us our worth was measured by our willingness to destroy ourselves. I think about Coach Vance's motivational posters sometimes, the ones that said pain was weakness leaving the body. Turned out pain was actually our bodies trying to protect us from serious harm. Weakness wasn't in the players who sought medical treatment. Weakness was in the adults who let a charismatic coach hurt children for 12 years because he won basketball games. Weakness was in an institution that valued trophies more than student safety. Jamal, Christina, Trevor, and David are my friends now, bonded by shared trauma and shared purpose. We get together sometimes, this group of people who were broken by the same system and chose to build something better from the pieces. We talk about the ongoing physical pain, the psychological scars, the futures that were stolen, but we also talk about the work we're doing, the kids we're helping, the changes we're making. It's not healing exactly. Some things don't heal, but it's meaning, which sometimes matters more. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.